Okay, hello. Here I am Maria and I am back and I am ready to read you chapter 4 of The George and Marina, Duke and Duchess of Kent. It is written by Christopher Warwick, and this particular chapter is about Marina and how they had to go in and out of exile in Greece. She was at 14 at the time. It was around 1920. And at this particular time, she had to go in and out of exile with Greece. The Greek monarchy was very unstable. So I'm just going to get right to it so you can hear her accounts of her from 14 on. And it took place in the time period of 1920. So here we go. Chapter 4, A Brief Return. 1 month after the death of Grand Duchess Vladimir, news reached the exiled royal family that King Alexander lay dying at Tatoy. In shocked disbelief, they learned how on 2 October, the 27-year-old king had spent part of the day working on his motorbike. Without changing out of his greasy overalls, he had then taken Fritz, his German shepherd dog, for a walk. On his way back, he called on the keeper of the estate's vineyards and his wife. It was while talking with them that one of the keeper's pets, Barbary macaques, attacked or had been attacked by Fritz. In attempting to separate them, a second monkey attacked the king, inflicting 2 bites to his arm and his ankle. Despite the wounds having been cleaned and dressed, they became infected, and septicemia set in. From Switzerland, the king's desperate mother, Queen Sophie, begged repeatedly to be allowed to return to Greece to be with her son, who in his delirium on 19 October had been calling out for her. When the Greek government refused the queen's pleas, she asked in utter despair if her mother-in-law, Queen Olga, might be allowed to travel to Athens to be with her grandson. This request was granted, but it was delayed by rough seas. The Dowager Queen's arrival at Tatoy came too late. King Alexander had died 12 hours earlier at 5:20 p.m. on 25 October 1920. In a sense, the monkey bites that led to the unexpected death of Greece's puppet king also claimed a second victim. For in permitting Queen Olga's return, Prime Minister Venizelos underestimated the wealth of popular feeling that surrounded the widow of the nation's much-loved King George I. In the general election of 15 November that had been called before Alexander's death, Venizelos was defeated. Of the 370 seats in the Greek parliament, his party had won only 120. Amid scenes of rejoicing, the new royalist prime minister, Dimitrios Rallis, asked to see the Queen Dowager. When she received him, Rallis was so overcome with emotion as he knelt to kiss Queen Olga's hand that she had to urge him to rise. When he refused, she too went down on her knees, assuring him that she would not get up unless he did. The purpose of Rallis's emotional mission was to ask the Queen to become regent of Greece, pending the return of the rightful sovereign, King Constantine I. It was an office she held until her son returned to the throne on 19 December. Following the plebiscite, he had personally called to gauge the nation's wishes. Of the 1,010,788 votes cast, only 10,000 were opposed to the king's return. The reception King Constantine and Queen Sophie received when they arrived in Athens was euphoric. Prince Nicholas, who had already seized the moment and returned home to the Nicholas Palace with Ellen, Marina, Olga, and Elizabeth, described the scene. The royal train had been shunted onto a sideline which, running through one of the streets, ended up at a small square, where we awaited its arrival. When they saw it coming about a mile off, the people could not contain their emotion. The cry, "Ericetta, Ericetta, he's coming," which had been the password ever since they heard the king was on his way to Greece. They rose like the roar of an ocean wave. The engine, all beflagged, was painfully plowing its way through a seething mass of people yelling, crying, gesticulating, sobbing hysterically. Slowly the train crawled to its destination and came to a halt in front of where our mother stood. She stepped first into the carriage, and we followed her to get to greet the king. It would be impossible to describe his emotion. Imagine what deep sorrows he had been through, what this spontaneous manifestation of loyalty and love from his people meant to him. In the midst of the scenes, Prince Nicholas went on to describe at even greater length. Few could have guessed that the royal family's joyful return to Greece would be short-lived. On the horizon, yet more storm clouds, a legacy of the Venizelist years. They were already gathering and would bring with them another and still longer exile for the Greek royals. For the moment, however, Princess Marina was able to celebrate her 14th birthday on the 13th of December with a proper family celebration at their home in Athens. On the threshold of young adulthood, Marina was now a tall, slender girl with rich brown hair framing a clear-skinned oval face. Indeed, her striking good looks had already started to turn heads. Friends of her parents frequently remarked upon Marina's high cheekbones and amber-colored eyes, while her somewhat crooked smile was described by admirers as enchanting. In later years, her voice, to some, was fascinating. To others, it was guttural and unbecoming. It was both deep and husky. Her speech was clipped and staccato, and her accent sometimes described as slightly Greek. But it was as Russian as her mother's. For Marina and her family, another cause for celebration at this time was the return of their beloved Foxy in the capacity of a loyal retainer, which somehow seemed to strengthen the growing sense of normality in Athens generally, and indeed in the place of Tatoi, which had recently been rebuilt. For Marina, however, the return to normality also meant a return to the schoolrooms. Though that unwelcome routine was often outweighed by more pleasurable diversions, among them on the 10th of March, 1921. For instance, this was the wedding of Marina's cousin, Princess Helen, or Sita as she was known, the eldest of King Constantine's three daughters, to Prince Carol of Romania, afterwards King Carol II. In Corfu, exactly 3 months later, on June the 10th, Marina's aunt Alice, Princess Andrew of Greece, have already had 4 daughters, and they gave birth to their son, who is registered under the name Philippos. Then, sixth in line to the Greek throne, he would, 26 years later, marry Britain's future queen, Elizabeth II, no longer as Prince Philippos of Greece and Denmark, but he was a Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten of the Royal Navy. He was newly created His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh. It was also about this time that Marina's lifelong friendship with Princess Juliana of Netherlands. She was later Queen Juliana, who reigned from 1948 until her abdication in 1980. First began, Juliana was 3 years younger than Marina, had recently developed an interest in philatelity and to acquire Greek stamps for her collection. Her mother, Queen Wilhelmina, suggested that Juliana should write to the youngest of Prince Nicholas's daughter. In that time, the rapport the two princesses established as pen friends developed into a warm personal friendship. As they grew up, they often visited one another, and in 1934, Princess Marina married. Juliana was one of her bridesmaids. Later still, during the 1960s, Marina was among the special guests at the celebration of Queen Juliana and her husband Prince Bernard's silver wedding anniversary. But to return to the years of Marina's youth, it was apparent that through her burgeoning sophistication and sense of self worth, she would become every bit as aware of her royal and imperial heritage as her mother. However, it did nothing to diminish her sense of humor or her enthusiasm for enjoying life. Baron Helena van der Hoven cites one example of the simple games Marina and some of her cousins enjoyed playing on an island adjoining Spetsi. Called Keeping House, it centered on a favorite fig tree. One crossed in a sailing boat to this island and picnicked on the beach, the Baroness wrote. Then they climbed the tree. Each member of the party had her own branch, which represented her room, and all the figs on the branch were entirely her property. One could visit each other and exchange fruits, which was carefully passed over on fresh green leaves. It needed a lot of agility not to drop any, and if such a misfortune happened, it was greeted with a lot of merry laughter and jokes. Though one of the youngest, Princess Marina was always the ringleader and kept the company in fits of laughter by mimicking her governess, of whom she gave striking imitations. There were also some other pranks which necessitated a certain amount of tactics and daring, and our contemporaries learned to know so well that humorous, half-wistful, half-mischievous smile was the smile of the young Princess Marina. One of the favorite games in those days was shooting arrows. The bows were homemade of flexible branches tied firmly with a bit of string, and great competition took place as to who should produce the best weapon. It was great fun hiding behind trees and rocks and shooting at invisible enemies, and Robin Hood and other similar heroes were very popular at that time. Away from the realms of make-believe, there were few heroes in Greece in the early 1920s. For Princess Marina, her sisters and cousins to look up to or to emulate. In January 1921, though much against the king's wishes, Greek forces had again been mobilized to take on the Turks, this time over the question of sovereignty in Asia Minor. Prosecuted until September 1922, the war resulted in a wholesale slaughter of much of the Greek army. Over 300,000 troops, including King Constantine and his brother Nicholas and Andrew, had gone to war marching, as Prince Christopher put it, straight away into a wasp nest, prepared by the military genius of Mustafa Kemal. Inevitably, someone had to take responsibility for the decimation of Greek forces at Smyrna. And that someone conveniently, perhaps obviously, was King Constantine himself. In the meantime, with her husband away at war and Marina on what was to be an extended visit to England with Miss Fox, Princess Nicholas accepted an invitation to stay in Cannes with her brother-in-law, Prince Christopher, and his immediately rich American wife, the twice widowed Nani, otherwise known as Nancy, Stewart. Nancy Stewart Worthington Leeds, or the Dollar Princess, as the one-time stenographer was known in the United States. Olga and Elizabeth accompanied Princess Nicholas to Cannes, and it was there in the spring of 1922 that Olga met and became engaged to her distant cousin, Crown Prince Frederick of Denmark, the 23-year-old son of King Christian V. Actually, the 23-year-old son of King Christian X. At that time, Olga was arguably the most physically attractive of Prince and Princess Nicholas's daughters, and before long, she was being enthusiastically, if fatuously, described in the popular press as the most beautiful princess in Europe. Nevertheless, Crown Prince Frederick, or Rico as he was known in family circles, was greatly enamored and attentively paid court. As it was then called, the young princess. For her part, Olga was completely overwhelmed by the speed at which she was being wooed, and apparently won. For as Neil Balfour, her future son-in-law, explained in his biography, Paul of Yugoslavia, she was 19, and though in behavior and manner she was well trained and therefore seemingly grown up and sophisticated, she was at heart a child, a romantic and vulnerable. She was a pious teenager, conscious of her role as the eldest daughter and longing to think the right thoughts and feel the right feelings. As the weeks slipped by, however, and hopes for a late summer wedding began to fade, so it started to become painfully obvious that Prince Frederick's ardor was beginning to cool. Then suddenly, as Prince Christopher put it, a misunderstanding arose. That misunderstanding, as friends of Princess Marina later assessed, it had a lot to do with Frederick's fondness for the bottle. Indeed, it had been said that when Rico and Olga appeared in public on one occasion, the prince was completely drunk. Instead of taking Olga's hand in his own to acknowledge the cheers of the small crowd, he took that of her sister Elizabeth's instead. It isn't certain whether the one incident constituted the sudden misunderstanding Prince Christopher referred to, but clearly something had occurred to cause a rift between the couple. That September, Rico and Olga agreed to meet in order to discuss the future. On 8 September, the bewildered princess, who might have become Queen of Denmark, confided to her in her diary, If I only knew what a state of mind he's in. Is he bitter and resolved to break off the engagement? I only hope he will listen to me, and after that, if he will still remain the same, it means he never really loved me. 3 days later, Rico and Olga talked together for almost an hour. But he wrote the princess, he had quite made up his mind to give it up. I said I was willing to try again, but he said he had no more love for me. It couldn't have been very strong while it was there. Distressing though the whole sorry episode had undoubtedly been for both the Greek and the Danish royal families, it can't be said that Princess Olga had lost her ideal husband, Neil Balfour wrote. The pressure was certainly there for the engagement to continue, and although Olga had tried to steel herself for the occasion, she was inevitably apprehensive. She had scarcely had time to fall in love with Rico, but she had enjoyed the flattery and the attention and had responded in all the established ways. She had subsequently realized that her dreams of a romantic love affair, ending happily ever after in marriage, were an illusion. At a family gathering soon after Olga's engagement had officially ended, the marital post-mortem was interrupted by 16-year-old Princess Marina. Sitting quietly, sketching by a window, she had all but been forgotten by the adults locked in earnest discussion until a voice demanded, Why the hell should Olga marry him if she doesn't love him? I wouldn't. Princess Nicholas turned to Prince Christopher and smiled. Out of the mouths of babes. 1 year later, Olga did marry for love, but a further 13 years were to pass before Crown Prince Frederick later, who became King Frederick IX of Denmark, took a wife, and when he did, in May 1935, his bride was Princess Ingrid of Sweden, the only daughter of Britain's Prince Margaret of Connaught and her husband, the Swedish Crown Prince, afterwards, who became King Gustav VI Adolf. Marina's visit to England during the spring and early summer of 1922 meant that she missed the initial excitement of her sister's ill-starred engagement. But when she and Foxy arrived in London, there was more than enough family news to catch up on. Visiting George V and Queen Mary at Windsor and Queen Alexandra at Sandringham. For instance, it meant hearing all about the wedding that February of the King and Queen's only daughter, Princess Mary to Henry, Viscount Lascelles. Later, he became Earl of Hereward, and through letters and postcards following the progress of Edward, Prince of Wales, known as David, to his family, who was then on an official tour in the Far East. For Marina, indeed, for her entire family, the freedom to travel after the restricted years in Switzerland was both a pleasure and a relief. But to travel through the choice was one thing. To wander as an exile, it was quite another. The disastrous campaign in Asia Minor concluded that September meant that when Marina rejoined her family, she did so as a refugee once more. In 1922, Greece had demanded, at this time, secured the formal abdication of King Constantine. Then, as before, those in power expelled all but 2 members of the royal family, Prince George, who now became King George II, and Constantine's brother, Prince Andrew. Taking revenge against those considered to have been responsible for the war, the disillusioned army officers were arrested, several prominent ministers. Shortly afterwards, Prince Andrew, now back at home at his villa in Mont Repos on the island of Corfu, was requested to travel to Athens in order to give evidence at the trial. Well, no sooner had he arrived than he himself had been arrested and imprisoned. He was accused of having helped instigate the war with Turkey. Among his family, now in Italy at the start of their second exile, concern for Prince Andrew was exacerbated by the fact that all communication with him was forbidden. His guard, as his brother Christopher recalled, kept the strictest watch and confiscated all the letters and parcels. Even food sent in by sympathizers was closely examined. And even foie gras, an aspic with which a dear old lady intended to console him, was hacked to pieces before he was allowed to eat it. Finally, in a desperate attempt to make contact with the prisoner, Prince Christopher hit on the happy expedient of writing a letter on the cigarette paper. He rolled it tightly, putting it in with other cigarettes into his valet case. In this way, it reached him safely. He answered it with a short note full of courage, but reading between the lines, I knew he had no longer any hope of regaining his freedom. He had just had a conversation with his former school friend, M. Pengalos, now Minister of War and instigator of his trial, that had left him small grounds for optimism. How many children have you? Pengalos had questioned, and when my brother, surprised at the irrelevance of the question, told him, he shook his head. Poor things. What a pity, they will soon be orphans. Each of the imprisoned ministers charged with high treason for having voluntarily and by design permitted the incursion of foreign troops into the territory of the kingdom, faced the firing squad. The same fate, however, despite his apparently doom-laden exchange with the new Minister of War, did not await Prince Andrew. For a while, the court-martial found him guilty of disobeying an order during a battle and abandoning his post in the face of the enemy, he escaped the sentence of death, as it was officially put, to his lack of experience in commanding a large army. Instead, he was sentenced to degradation of rank and banishment from Greece for life. Behind the scenes, pressure had all been mounting after the prince's family made effective representations to powerful people. Prince Andrew dispatched appeals to several European heads of state. Queen Olga wrote to the kings of England and Spain, while Princess Christopher appealed to the Pope. All had reacted positively, urgently sending emissaries to Athens, but it was the government of Andrew's British cousin, King George V, that sent HMS Calypso, a C-class light cruiser that had been seeing action during the Second Battle of Helgoland Bight in 1917, to Phaleron, to effect the prince's highly secret departure the afternoon on 3 December 1922. Already on board was Prince Andrew's wife, Princess Alice. The next day, en route to southern Italy via Brindisi, Rome, and Paris, the family made its way to London. The Calypso paused briefly at Corfu to pick up Andrew and Alice's 5 children, the youngest of whom was the 18-month-old Prince Philip. Toward the end of what had been a profoundly disturbing year, Princess Nicholas, who had only recently recovered from diphtheria, left Paris, where she had stayed since the end of Olga's engagement. For Palermo, in the Sicilian capital where members of the royal family had gathered, she rejoined her husband and now ex-King Constantine and Queen Sophie. When Princess Marina and her sisters also arrived after a short holiday in Kamenix, Marina immediately summoned up the general sense of dismay by saying, though not without a touch of humor, we really needn't have unpacked our trunks. For the next year or so, Prince Nicholas and his family would find themselves unpacking and packing with increased regularity until they eventually settled on somewhere to live. Their travels had already begun in a small way after they grew restless in Palermo and moved on to what Princess Olga, until recently surrounded by a gilded splendor of Ritz in Paris, unhappily described as a god-forsaken, perfectly foul hilltop hotel in San Remo. Nevertheless, it was there in circumstances distinctly at odds with what they had been used to. The Prince and Princess Nicholas and their daughter spent the Christmas of 1922. Early in the new year, they were on the move again, this time to Murano in Tyrol, where both Marina and Elizabeth underwent operations for the removal of their adenoids. As they recuperated, their parents took Olga to Florence, where to her delight, they spent 3 absorbing weeks visiting the palaces, the museums, and the art galleries. Prince Nicholas had so often spoken of them. By the beginning of April, the family was making plans to visit England, an idea suggested to them by George V's sister, Princess Victoria, otherwise known as Cousin Toria, with a view to their doing the season and perhaps hoping that Olga might attract the attention of the Prince of Wales. He was the most eligible royal bachelor in the world. Leaving Murano on the 31st of May, the family booked into the Granby Court Hotel in the Queen's Gate, Kensington, 8 days later. And that is the end of chapter 4. So they are in exile, which was a very common thing for Marina's family, for the Greek monarchy at the time. And you see mentioned Prince Philip's mother and his family lived in exile. And Prince Philip was just 18 months old. He was just a baby. And, he was a prince without a home. And that was the state of their life then. So, it's interesting to see the way they lived, in the instability at that time. But anyways, that was the time. So that is the end of chapter 4.